I am very proud to be associated with the Alfred Deakin Institute at Deakin University. I'm going to be talking to you today about how religion may inform youth activism for viability in the Global South. Now, the first thing I'm going to say is that global flourishing, which is one of the themes of this conference, is to some extent premised on viability as defined perhaps best at the moment by Ghassan Hage's work on viability. And so that's the connection that's made here. Over many years of doing research in Indonesia, which is in the Global South, and perhaps I should have just called it in Indonesia, but I think it's also emblematic of the way religion may be taken up and used in a positive way for activism in other parts of the Global South. So that's the exemplar that I'm referring to. So many years of doing research in Indonesia, and I started to realise, because Indonesia is a very complex country and cannot be reduced to any single set of religious norms. However, what I noticed when I was doing a big project on youth a number of years ago with my colleague Lynn Parker from the University of Western Australia was that young people were actively referencing Green Islam, as it was at that time and still is, and it's probably flourished even beyond that. And they were actively using it in their practice. It was really a praxis, if you like, in that sense. And then a few years later, I started a small project, unfunded this time, on Catholic youth and their adherence to kind of a libertarian theology, if you like, within the Catholic tradition, and how they saw themselves as going out and the world. Now, what struck me was that these young people could quote any amount of the Quran and the Bible to justify their various practices. And I sort of realised that one of the things they were doing was they felt that everything they did in the world was, in a way, a blessed endeavour, that they were aiming for harmony on the planet. Therefore, I'm talking here about global flourishing and viability. I'm just saying that because I'm going to go through a number of pragmatic things on the slides before I get back to that particular sort of conceptual idea. Okay, you're seeing what I'm seeing. Okay, these are some of the young people that I interviewed in Palembang in Sumatra, and they represent the kind of range of young people who are involved in activism. They're actually a mixture of Christian or Catholic in this case, and Muslim youth who were co-engaged in various activism endeavours in the city of Palembang. Now, I'm going to illustrate how devout young activists make use of their respective theological traditions. And it's slightly different. I'm using two completely different and unrelated data sets in a way to make a point, as they're acting as sort of mini case studies to bear out my conceptual argument. The Catholic youth activists are reaching out to other young people of faith, both Christian Protestant youth and also Muslim youth, to find common cause in shoring up nationalism and democracy. And for the Muslim youth activists, they were engaging with communities of the urban Muslim poor to bring about greater environmental protection. And they're reaching for greater viability through religiously enhanced activism, trying to make the world a better place. Now, Indonesia is a very, very, very large country, and the median age at the moment, according to the figures that I referenced for this address, is 29.4 years, which is lower than the global median of 30.3 years. So Indonesia has a very young, I suppose, demographic. In 2023, approximately 87%, some say it's more, was Muslim. So it's a country with the largest Muslim population in the world, even though it's not actually it's not a Muslim state, it's not a Muslim country as such. Now, 3.12% are Roman Catholics. Now, this goes back to the history of colonisation, of course. So they are located primarily in the eastern islands of Indonesia, but there's a strong community in Java, which has always had a nationalist incline. And this is where the young activists that I interviewed come from. Now, according to my colleague, Dr. Anissa Betta, who's at the University of Melbourne now, Indonesia's youth exhibit a unique blend of qualities. They're captivating, they're defiant and revolutionary, and they're creative. I find young Indonesians, by and large, very idealistic in the most positive sense of the word. They're looking beyond their circumstances of the present to a possible viable future. Yet they continue to navigate a fairly precarious life filled with uncertainties that are unfortunately characteristic of their generation, because Indonesia, like the rest of the world, is caught up in a global economic and neoliberal economic framework that dictates precarity, especially in the youth labour market. They can't really escape that. Now, religion in the state. Now, Indonesia is a democratic secular state, and one could argue about democratic. I know my colleagues in political science would ask a few questions there, but anyway, formally, it's a democratic secular state. It recognises 6 religions. And the national constitution enshrines the principles of what they call Pancasila, which is an old Sanskrit word. A sila is like a plank or an element or something. And the first is belief in God, just and civilised humanity, unity of Indonesia, democracy, guided by the wisdom of deliberations among representatives and social justice. Now, the data sets. Now, data on the environmental activism was collected from 20 young Muslim environmental activists on various university campuses in Java and Sumatra. The interviews were conducted in Bahasa Indonesia and co-translated by me and my research assistant. Those interviews were part of a much larger study of young environmental activists in an ARCD project. And then we did a small independent project, not with Lynn, with another colleague, Indonesian colleague, on activism from 20 Catholic youth. And they were also conducted in Bahasa Indonesia, with, of course, endless sidelines into Bahasa Jawa and Bahasa everything else, but were able to be translated by my research assistant. Now, viability. I go here to define what I actually mean by viability. Now, according to Craig Jeffrey and Jane Dyson in 2022, viability is defined as the ability to survive, to exist independently. That comes from the physical sciences, from animal study and also plant study. For Jeffrey and Dyson, viability describes the way young people rise to challenges by collectively developing integrated modes of action that traverse the life domains and generate new perceptions and understandings, different ways of viewing the world. Now, for Ghassan Hage, viability constitutes future potentiality in the present. It exists for something that is yet to come. So I'm not going to quote Ghassan Hage at length because he is a very dense theoretical writer, but that's the sense in which he's framing up the concept of viability. Thus, an instance of activism might have a salience beyond itself. In the religious field, that can be understood as the quality of immanence. And I'll just go on to explain what I mean by immanence. Immanence connotes the idea that the divine or the Godhead encompasses or is manifested in the material world. So devout activism seeks to instantiate change in the present towards a future more fully framed within God's plan. Now, you can already see that this could go one way or it could go the other way. I mean, taken in a sort of bleak and negative direction, it would mean a particular kind of activism for an Islamic state in Indonesia, for example. However, I guess I'm pointing out, using my data, that there is another direction that it can also go. That's a benefactive direction framed within God's plan. And to recognise the habitual invocation of immanence in the activist discourse of these devout young Indonesians, I use the concept of recursion. Recursion may be understood as a reflective looping process by which transcendental meaning is repeatedly constituted, perhaps even re-enchanted, if we want to go in that direction, as new phenomena are encountered. So no matter what the difficulties are, and the young people we interviewed certainly talked about lots of difficulties in what they were attempting to do, each new obstacle is understood as part of the pathway. God wants us to meet these challenges, was the kind of summary of the kind of attitude that they brought to bear when they encountered various obstacles towards their, in regard to their activism and their goals. Now, just to set the political context of Indonesia, which is important for both of the data sets, in Indonesia, leaders claiming to speak for a self-professed Muslim majority, whatever that might mean, fan the flames of sectarianism for their own political gain. Now, many people have written on this. I'm just referencing Robert Hefner there. Some of the effects are arbitrary state crackdowns on the freedom of speech, deterioration in the protection of minority rights, including those of religious faiths other than Sunni Islam. Shia Islam gets a hard rap in Indonesia. It's not treated well. Leading that charge, arguably, in Indonesia are hardline Salafi Wahhabi fundamentalists who've been increasingly influential since the end of authoritarian rule. And I reference my two colleagues in the room, Greg Barton and actually Ihsan's not here, is he? Okay, well, just Greg in that case. But Ihsan also worked on those papers. All right. On the other hand, and this is really the thrust of my paper, I suppose, there are important progressive movements within Indonesian Islam that promote harmony and tolerance. And I'm absolutely very grateful to Greg Barton, who's written at length on this topic and has researched it in depth. Now, the two mass Muslim organisations are Nahdlatul Ulama, always referred to as NU, but I guess I'll keep calling it NU because I'm used to it, and Muhammadiyah. Now, neo-traditionalist NU has an estimated 90 million members, which is a huge membership. And I guess it's concentrated primarily in the main islands, but that's because the eastern islands are, for the most part, not Muslim dominated. And they advocate a locally inflected Islam, which they call Islam Nusantara, which means the Islam of the archipelago, I suppose, in a general sense. Now, neo-modernist Muhammadiyah has around 60 million members, and Muhammadiyah anchors a modernist Islam in the provision of education, health services, and social services. In short, Indonesian Islam, and there's endless sort of offshoots and smaller groupings within Islam in Indonesia, it's not a simple continuum, but a fractured, not fractured in the negative sense, but a fairly segmented, I suppose, set of theologically aligned groups that shift dynamically along with political currents and social events, including world events. So that has to be kept in mind. Now, as the Muslim scholar Azra, who was one of the leading scholars of Indonesian Islam, points out, all but a small minority of Muslim Indonesians support moderation, social order, and economic security. A peaceful, harmonious future. So Marzuki Wahid, who's co-founder of the Islamic Institute Framina, maintains that progressive Islam is a liberating Islam that offers new views, and that will become more relevant later when I get to the data. Now, the ideal of a forward-looking, liberating Islam, you can see, resonates with Catholic liberation theology, which in its stated goals seeks to open the minds of those with privilege and to liberate the poor. In essence, both are progressive, benefactive religious discourses that can be operationalised within activism to bring about positive goals. I just thought I'd show you that one because it's very, very the kind of thing that gets memed around among the Green Islam activists. Now, I'll just briefly cover the environmental crisis because I'm going into the Muslim youth activism data first. So Indonesia ranks third for greenhouse gas emissions after China and India, second for contributing to plastic waste in the oceans, and third for overall pollution in the world. 4 of the world's most polluted rivers are in Indonesia. And there's annual forest and peatland burning that blankets the whole of the Southeast Asian region. That is a problem every year. Now, Indonesia has many. It's not a lack of actual having environmental regulations or signing up to international agreements, but there's an endemic culture of self-interest and corruption that thwarts implementation. It's really implementation on the ground that's the problem, rather than yet another government policy. And more at the grassroots level, more and more young people are becoming involved in environmental campaigns, especially, I would say, if they're sufficiently well educated to access the online scientific information. The young people who I interviewed were all at university, which means they were well educated and could, in fact, access the more scientific reports on climate change, weather change in Indonesia, and other issues. And even more so if their English is strong, and that includes Green Islam. Now, because Green Islam is a worldwide movement, much of the Green Islam stuff is in English because it's the lingua franca between many Muslim countries in the world where you could say, well, Arabic maybe, but Turkey, young people in Turkey don't speak Arabic for the most. They might know some classical Arabic, but they're certainly not speaking it daily. So in fact, English is the lingua franca of the Green Islam movement worldwide. It's not that it doesn't circulate within countries in the language of that country, but that's the global level on which it's operating. Now, I'll just go to some of the sort of, I'm not a religious studies person, so please don't ask me any theological questions because I'll just look blank. I'm a youth researcher. So anyway, but I have to take this into account because of my topic. So Yildirim maintains that as much 1/8 of the Quran asks Muslims to consider the beauty and perfection of nature and their surroundings. Now, Islam was sort of came to exist in an rather inhospitable desert environment. So there was deep awareness not only of the beauty of nature, but its actual limits, and this is very important. Thus, verses in the Quran place value on natural resources. Trees and water are particularly mentioned, and other things like fruits and harvest and so on. And the Islamic tradition, according to Yildirim, rejects cutting down trees without a legitimate reason because they are very valuable on so many levels. Moreover, and deeper put in the holy text itself, to serve God, one must do one's best for the benefit and balance of all living things. Muslims should not only worship the Creator and obey the rules, but act responsibly towards nature, preserve life, and avoid abuse and wastefulness. And there are numerous verses within the Quran that refer to that. Now, the mainstream Indonesian media rarely mentions troubling environmental issues. I mean, I read at least one Indonesian newspaper every day to try and check whether I can continue to keep saying this, and I can. Those topics are discussed, however, in politically critical online spaces. Young environmentalists can readily find the discourse of Green Islam online in Indonesian. Theologically informed actions and protests, when they occur, recursively, and I'm using my idea of recursion here, over and over again, graft religion onto the task of preserving the natural world, thereby prefiguring a more environmentally viable future, linking viability to the continuing flourishing of the planet. Now, the young Muslim environmentalists explained their activist engagement as a form of what I call a transcendent endeavour. Transcendent because its benefits went beyond the material in that sense. They cited verses of the Quran that talk about the moral role of human beings as God's appointed stewards or lieutenants on earth, using the term Khalifa. They believed they were not only protecting God's creation, but doing God's work on earth. Now, one of the young people who was campaigning to clean up the Ciliwung River, which is a task in itself, described his ecological awareness as follows. He said, harmony must be both vertical and horizontal. Hablum, this is Arabic, so I'm going to struggle to pronounce it, but hablum minallah, hablum minana. Praise be to God, that's why I got my environmentalism. Now, hablum minallah references the paradigm of holding fast to the rope of God. That's the vertical dimension of faith. Hablum minanas means grasping the horizontal bond that connects community and humanity together. So this is a kind of a XY axis, I suppose, if you want to map it in that sense, of where they believe that their actions are located. There's also the phenomenon in the interviews of religious epiphany in nature. Now, Fahmy explained, who was another informant, explained that the Quran not only celebrates nature and wildlife as a mirror to the lush forests of paradise above, but endows human beings with the responsibility and quoted, "He has given you the earth for your heritage." The translations here are a complicated thing where they weren't speaking Arabic, they were speaking Indonesian, and then I had to look at the Indonesian, and then I had to work out what it meant in English, and then I had to find a version of the Quran that had, look, so please don't task me with the translations here, but the spirit of the thing is, he has given you the earth for your heritage. And he says, I realise the truth of Quran. If someone takes care of their surrounding environment, then God will look after them, both in this world and the hereafter. And this is the transcendent kind of blessed practice aspect of this activism. And really that's been proven so right. and we regret mistakes such as littering that fresh environment. It was written, and once again, I actually couldn't track this one down, but he's quoting either a hadith or the Quran, I'm not sure. I took love from the sky and spread it upon the face of the earth. And so that's that one. Now, this is a very Sunda name, so apologies. She wanted to, you know, her chosen pseudonym was In, which is strange to people from other cultures, but anyway. It looks like Lin, but it's In, which is a very Sunda name. She felt she was living out a mandate from God. In my religion, there's an order from God that humans on earth should behave as Khalifa, environmental guards, peacekeepers on earth, and must not create damage. Now, I did track this verse down. The Lord said to the angels, I am placing on the earth one that shall rule as my deputy, Khalifa. And deputy is been translated. I found various English translations that went from everything to steward to deputy to regent to whole kinds of other words. So perhaps Khalifa is one of those words, sui generis. It's a thing in itself and it's hard to translate for that reason. And Bakhtiar was part of a Yogyakarta group protesting about tourist industry overdevelopment, which has indeed removed urban green space from Jogja. He believed that the cityscape should be returned to a much more natural scape. And he explained we should ideally establish a good relationship with nature, you know. That's what we hope for, our ideal. When Allah gives us something, we should take care of it. And once again, there's this feeling of needing to take care. And Pertiwi, who was one of the young women who was in the first slide in Palembang, she was a member of a devoutly Muslim activist group of young people campaigning to clean up the Musi River. And they used a boat to conduct awareness-raising sessions in riverside communities. And she says, I remember one verse in the Quran about the destruction of the earth. Look at our ancestors. Allah became very angry with them, right? He was not only angry because of human nature itself damaging the environment, but because of human actions directly violating something Allah himself had created. That is haram. So she was actually sort of really pushing the point here. Now, I'll just describe what Pertiwi and her friends would do. None of them owned a boat because they were students and didn't have very much money, but they managed to persuade through one of the mosque associates, a boatman with an outboard motor, to load them all on board. And they would go up and down the Musi River, which is the main river that runs through Palembang, which is very polluted. And they would stop at these riverside communities and they would hop off and do a kind of little roadshow about how people ought to be disposing of their waste. And they explained it theologically, and then it hot on the boat. I tried to go with them, but they said I was too heavy and would sink the boat. So there you go, I didn't get on. And up and down the river they would go. And I did take a boat trip with them, but I sort of paid for a much more solid boat. And they just pointed out that they said, oh, we can't have you going there as a bulle. They'd think it was very strange indeed. So I couldn't go with them anyway. But it was obvious that they were really throwing themselves into this endeavour, and they would spend a whole day doing this sort of outreach work, working directly into the riverside communities. A final example from data that I didn't collect, but one of my PhD students collected, and we co-published a paper that cites it. And a large protest march was organised by Bandung youth activists campaigning to save the rather beautiful city forest that sits in the middle of Bandung called Babakan Siliwangi. And before the march began, amid the greenery, a young woman, a leader, Kani, made an inspirational speech, and she refers directly to her faith in this speech. She said, friends, in today's action, we aim to defend this beloved urban forest. And she raised her head as if praying and inhaled the fresh air. Try and grasp that on either side of you are green creatures that breathe and dance like us. They have lives like human beings and we ought to defend them. So do not hesitate to be loud later on the street. We defend nature today. Be convinced that Allah is with us. And this was an intensely moving speech and really wound up all the young activists who were in the parade and in the march. And in fact, eventually they attracted enough media attention and they occupied the area in front of the city gates of the council, of the city council, really, and that refused to be moved. And then other people came out and joined the protest. In the end, Babakan Siliwangi was saved from the development that was threatened upon it by the mayor of the time. So that was a very successful piece of activism on their part. Okay, so they sometimes alluded to their environmental struggle as a hard journey guided by God. This is the obstacle. However, there's theological guidance for dealing with that, such as he created man to try him with affliction. This is about 3 or 4 that I found that seem to match the kind of apparent citations that they were making in the interview. He created death and life that he might put you to the proof and find out which one of you acquitted himself the best. Heroic struggle to protect the perfection of God's given bounty on earth may be regarded as a kind of trial by fire towards spiritual growth or spiritual reward. Now, their accounts acknowledge the difficulties of challenging the status quo in Indonesia. Nevertheless, they look to God. Many Muslims believe their good deeds will be recognised by Allah as ibadah and that these deeds could save them on Judgment Day, according to Martin Slama, a very well-known writer on the topic. Since God has blessed human beings with free will, the person who chooses to do good in the world, including pro-environmental actions, will be rewarded in heaven. I've reduced it down to a simple kind of algorithm, I suppose. That's what you do and that's what you get. Now, I'm moving now to Catholic youth activism, and which is also has various environmental streams, I must say. But I'm not actually talking about their environmental activism here. I'm talking about something else. Now, in Central Java, young people are raised in intensive Catholic communities of faith, and they look at the society of Indonesia through Catholic eyes. And their perceptions are inevitably shaped by the new climate of Islamisation that has swept the country, and that Martin van Brunissen has pointed out. At the extremist end of the Islamist rhetoric, there are calls for an Islamic state, implying exclusion of non-Muslims. It seems the separation of Catholic majority East Timor from the Indonesian Republic in 2001 was viewed by some Muslims as a challenge to the Muslim majority, and in their rhetoric they refer back to that act as indicative of what Catholics can do when they're framed then as a threat to the state. Now, divisive Islamisation may prompt young Catholics to try and play an active role in maintaining the secular nation, the democratic constitution that exists at the moment. So Catholic youth identity in Indonesia varies greatly according to, or anywhere in the world. If you grow up Catholic in a majority Catholic country, such as Mexico or the Philippines, I'm deliberately choosing Global South locations, it's very different compared to Malaysia or Indonesians, where Catholics are only a small minority. It's not surprising to find that Catholic youth in majority Indonesia are strong advocates for their own faith. While it's not a Muslim theocracy, religion is closely entwined with notions of citizenship in the state constitution, much like Malaysia. Indonesia's adoption of neoliberal economics has fostered a resurgent spiritual economy where nationalism is performed through demonstrating piety. And this has amplified the public piety expression and identity claims of other religions, including Catholicism. In Brunei, you can't actually wear a lot of a non-Muslim sort of symbols like a Christian cross or something. But in Indonesia, there's no ban of that kind operational. Now, the young Catholic informants frequently describe religious hatred. For example, the Islamic extremist mobs yell at us that we're kafir, telling us we don't belong in Indonesia. They act as if we're disgusting. And Richard and others felt that religious hatred was best challenged by the Catholic youth showing the spirit of love. And Dobie pointed out it's already part of Catholic teaching that if someone should strike one of your cheeks, turn the other cheek. So they had a whole lot of kind of theological sort of things to defend, precepts to defend themselves with in relationship to this. Now, young Catholic activists in Yogyakarta, moreover, had forged strategic connections with moderate Muslim youth. And Sanjaya talked about solidarity between young Catholics and who he called our friends in Nahdlatul Ulama, which is NU, whose inclusive motto is Islam Nusantara. When things happen in times of need, we always stand together. So NU youth wing members have voluntarily provided security for major Catholic church services in Yogyakarta since 2017 and continue to do so, especially at Easter and Christmas, and for any and Feast of All Saints and a couple of other things, especially during the Easter period when there's a number of major services. Now, since 2019, NHU has not allowed its members to refer to non-Muslims using the derogatory term kafir. Muslims should be non-Muslims should be referred to as human beings and citizens, giving them, within the secular state of Indonesia, the due respect that should be owed to them. Now, a seminary graduate called Yusuf had set up a little cafe that hosting political discussions about nation, this is in Jogja, political discussions about nationhood for young people of all faiths. And in sort of saying why, he spoke about living the Catholic theological principle, and this is Latin, I'm hopeless at that as well, duc in altum, I'll go with. Duc in altum means to put out into the deep. In the New Testament, Jesus said to Simon Peter, launch out into the deep and let down your nets, is a very famous thing from the Bible in the New Testament. Yusuf felt he was reaching out beyond the Catholic community to expand the multi-faith discourse of nationalism in order to protect the Pancasila constitution, which Catholics in Indonesia believe allows them to continue to openly practice their faith, which it does, I suppose. Now, for Catholic activists, the fields of religion and nationhood seem to be almost indivisible. Now, one young woman, Alita, was ticking them off on her fingers. She considered each principle. So the first principle, God, that clearly matches. The second one of humanity, also in line with Catholicism. Catholic unity of Indonesia, in line with Catholic values. Fourth principle, democracy, lines up. Fifth one, of course, social justice. So I conclude that it all fits together. So she was more than ready to map the Pancasila doctrine onto the Catholic faith, and therefore became part of what needed to be defended by her as a Catholic, as a young Catholic. And Yusuf was the same. Pancasila values are also the values of the Bible and God's teaching. If we look at the broad doctrinal outlines, love is in the Pancasila. Now, the Pancasila precepts in detail refer to just and civilised humanity, as I showed you before, and he's matching those precepts with thou shalt love thy neighbour as thyself from Matthew, love one another as I have loved you, and ye also love one another, John, and love worketh no ill to his neighbour, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law, which is from Romans. And Yusuf's words are an example of recursive claim for immanence in regard to defending the national constitution. You've got to keep defending it and keep defending it and keep defending it because it's linked deeply to God's purpose, to the theological teachings. Now, Pancasila has long been venerated in Indonesian Catholicism and is still the case today. For instance, the Archdiocese of Jakarta launched a 5-year campaign called Amalkan Pancasila, or Practice Pancasila, which focused on the political responsibility of Catholic citizens in the Indonesian nation. And mass organisation NU formally also acknowledges the Pancasila doctrine that shows affinity with Islamic principle. In short, liberal strands, or libertarian strands almost, of both Catholic and Muslim theocratic fields value unity and harmony in the nation and justify that using the Holy Scriptures, thus imparting immanence or divine purpose to their outgoing activism. So the interviewees, the Catholic interviewees, were proud of their productive legacy, and Catholics, from the early days of Indonesia, Catholics have contributed a lot. In history, the nation builders, Sukarno and Hatta, were surrounded by Catholics and they worked side by side. We were involved in shaping our nation's identity. Now, President Jokowi, who's just about to exit, or he has exited, I haven't been watching the news on that. I don't think has he exited yet? Yes. Okay, so he's gone. But when he was in power, he had one of his advisors was a Catholic academic and intellectual who he kept very close. Because there are many things being said about Jokowi, but he did try and at least nominally bring in other viewpoints, and he set that up fairly early in his presidentship. So there's a historical continuity here. If once upon a time to be anti-colonial was part of what it meant to be a Catholic, then today to be a fervent nationalist may be part of what it means to be a Catholic youth in Indonesia. The fervent nationalism was very obvious. Now, in terms of a discussion, both sets of informants had formed distinctive collectives within their respective communities of faith, following on from Jeffries and Dyson. They did not just identify as Muslim or Catholic per se, they were ardent followers of progressive Islam and libertarian Catholicism, respectively. And those orientations encouraged their commitment to matters of social and, in the other case, environmental justice. Now, intense sociality between members is required, and I'm going to something that I'm very much aware of as an older youth researcher. I have to remind myself of the intensity of the online engagement and the social media engagement around the key issues. Now, in both cases, members of these various groups meet online and offline to discuss the key problem and devise suitable tactics. And they have to engage their fellow Catholics or Muslims respectively and get them to follow their lead on taking various kinds of actions. Now, when I was writing this paper, I started to think about hope and ethics as larger concepts that might bear on it. And it seemed to me that the activist strategies I've described in this paper are often simultaneously about social or environmental survival and a higher order concern of hope, which gets back to the concept of viability. They certainly seem to have, they share a fundamental ethic of shared survival, that one's own life cannot be viable unless other people's lives are viable. And they use their distinctive religious faith as an ethical resource to prefigure viable everyday life in Indonesia. And hope is omnipresent in the ethos that drives what we might call their ecosystems of practice, borrowing from environmental theory. Now, despite their different socio-political goals, they were actively consolidating those ecosystems of practice. And the ecosystems of practice contain the sense of immanence and included non-human entities, especially the guiding deity and a set of canonical texts and the physical world in the case of the environmental activists. The spaces in their lives where religion and activism touch are infused with the dynamic of desire to do good, to amplify transformational practice into a transcendental benefit, both individually and collectively. And that's built on their shared theological sense that the best case scenario for world order reflects God's will as represented in what I must admit are selected passages from the holy texts. And harmony is part of their immanence. They were aiming to build open, harmonious, and sustainable life worlds. Now, the data reminds us, as social sciences, that what constitutes viability is not going to be the same for young people across the global south, especially those who occupy different social spaces. And the devout Indonesian youth ecosystems of practice depicted here give grounds for hope because they're consciously operating against the grain of the rest of society. They're deliberately setting themselves up against a larger trends. They challenge negative and fact-denying national trends. They apply healing theological precepts recursively to troubling real-world phenomena. In conclusion, I'd like to suggest that in the Global South, outward-looking religious faith can form the foundation of a strong network of activist practice for social benefit. As illustrated by the examples from Indonesia, devout young activists operationalise theological tricks and even traditions to create forms of integrated action to constitute valued religious eminence in their life domain. They produce viability by amplifying their critical engagement with the world, where activism is framed as a blessed quest to not only make a better life for themselves, but for their communities and, in the Catholic youth sense, the nation. Thank you.